Thank you very much for being here with us today. It's an absolute pleasure to start this first high-level discussion. And maybe following on the conversations that were had yesterday and maybe on the call that His Royal Highness gave us, when we think about multisectoral partnership in how we drive real progress, how we bring real kind of change in addressing violence against girls, maybe coming to you, Erin, what do you think are some of the strategies that have proven to be the most successful?
Great. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's such an honor to be here. Your Royal Highness, you set the stage so beautifully this morning, I think, for this conversation. Spotlight Initiative was launched in 2017 with seed funding from the European Union of 500 million euros, so a nice seed funding for an issue like violence against women and girls. With three really easy missives. One, eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls. Really easy. Second was to drive change across all of the Sustainable Development Goals. So use this issue of ending violence against women to drive meaningful change across the SDGs. Also really easy. And the third, really importantly, was to reform the UN. So when we were launched, in 2017, the Secretary General was relatively new, and he came in with a reform mindset. And this was his first flagship initiative. We were positioned under the Secretary General, and he said, let's use this to reform the United Nations. Great. So I was tapped to lead this initiative with these three really super simple missives. And so this is what I was met with. At the same time, the UN, I think it's 80 years old this year, and it has faced a number of challenges, not the least by civil society, who often find the UN abundantly difficult to navigate. It's complex, it's heavy, it's bureaucratic. It just feels like a real beast to navigate. And we knew that if we're dealing with an issue like ending violence against women and girls, we were going to have to really take a whole of society, comprehensive approach that was grounded in civil society. And in fact, civil society demanded this of us. When I got to the office on my first day, I was met with an 18-point missive from civil society of demands, saying, well, if the UN was going to get this money, this is what we want to see from the UN. And so I took that really seriously, and we did a few things. And so specifically, to answer your question, we did three things. One, we really meaningfully oriented all of our program in civil society, and what that looked like was deep investments first in civil society. So with 500 million euros, we did large-scale investments. So in sub-Saharan Africa, some of our programs were $30 million programs. About 50% of that went to civil society, and these were national, local, and grassroots civil society organizations that this money went to. So that was one thing, was just really deep, meaningful investments in civil society, and much of that was flexible funding too, so not allocated for any particular purpose, but civil society could define what that money was used for. And we simplified reporting, we simplified application processes, we made it less bureaucratic. We kind of tried to, again, reform the UN system as we were tasked to do. And the second was to ensure civil society was engaged at all levels of leadership to help define the initiative. So wherever the Deputy Secretary General sat, and she is the head of this initiative, so did civil society. At country level, wherever the head of state sat, who leads the initiative at country level, so did civil society. And so there was a real meaningful engagement. And what this did was create space for really open civic space. And in countries where this was nearly unheard of, in many countries in Latin America where civil society did not talk to government, Spotlight Initiative actually opened the door for civil society and government to have meaningful conversation and actual deep collaboration to advance this issue. And for an issue like ending violence against women and girls, this is essential. And that brings me to the second strategy, and there's only three, so I promise I'm wrapping up. The second is really ensure you have high-level government ownership. And so when we we always work with ministries of gender. That's our natural interlocutor. And so with Spotlight Initiative, we continued to empower gender ministries, but we also ensured we had commitment from the head of state. And we also engaged other ministries, ministers of finance, ministers of defense, ministers of education, ministers of health, to sit at the table to make sure that they were deeply committed to this. What that resulted in was national budget level commitments to ending violence against women and girls, and a truly sustainable approach to this issue, so that as we move into our second phase and reflect on the 26 countries we invested in our first phase, we're seeing sustainable knock-on gains from the initial investments, even if we're not investing in those countries anymore, because of the national commitment and the national ownership. And then the third is we took this whole of society approach. And what that also meant was we looked at, across the United Nations system, what was working really well. And we took the best of the UN and we brought that together in service to communities. I called it the everything, everywhere, all at once approach. And truly, that's what it was. It was really doing everything, everywhere, all at once in the best possible way in service to the people who need it the most. What this looked like from the lens of sport also was really considering how sport could have a force multiplier impact, right? So how could we use sport as a force for good in our prevention campaigns, in our work with communities, in our work through education ministers? And this was deeply personal to me. I'm a former competitive swimmer. I'm a former synchronized swimmer. I'm a coach right now. I'm a swim coach, and I'm a mom of a competitive swimmer. So I took this as a real personal missive to me. Spotlight Initiative is so excited. We're about to enter a formal partnership with the IOC to really make our next phase much, much deeper, and to look much more deeply at how we can integrate sport into the work that we're doing and have that be a more meaningful space for engagement with communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and well, congratulations on the partnership. I guess round of applause is due. Thank you. You said everything, everywhere, all at once, if I'm not mistaken, and maybe coming to you, Dr. Joanne. How do we use maybe that approach? How do we contextualize it, particularly in places like Africa, where we know that the social environment, the cultural environment is not necessarily something you can copy-paste into?
Thank you, and good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. In terms of practical approaches, I want to start by saying Africa is extremely diverse. We've got our islands, we've got the north, the west, completely different situations and environments and contexts for children. But there's different approaches that definitely do work well from my experience as the Africa Partnership to End Violence Against Children. And the first one, and I'll only speak to 3 or 4, is connecting the different actors. And His Royal Highness actually talked about this is not a problem that any one actor can solve on their own. So connecting, convening in such a way where we are able to build onto everybody's knowledge, capacities, and get collective commitment for collective action in a way that then catalyzes and multiplies the effects of every one single actor. So that's the first one. And just acknowledging that as we're doing these connections, it's got to be across different players, different sectors, different players in terms of civil society, in terms of within the government system itself. You're thinking of the health system, the education system, even the criminal and security systems, because children do get caught there and suffer violence there, and social welfare, social protection, etc. So that's one. The second strategy that we use that works quite well is knowledge building, sharing, dissemination, so the whole chain of knowledge management. And we had yesterday, we've got to make decisions based on what's known, on data, on evidence. We've got to document what is working and what is actually the impact and the results from that. So we have seen that really knowledge management systems, building knowledge, sharing it across silos so that there is less duplication, there's less repetition, but there's also a cumulative effect of every single actor's input. And this is where we can actually say that part of knowledge management also comes back to documenting what are the good practices we're saying let's use a human rights-based approach, but what are the norms, what are the standards that have been established, and what programs have been successful using these human rights-based approaches, and documenting that, and then so that it can then be borrowed, adapted and scaled up. For instance, by the sports movement is one of the places where there can be a very useful interconnection between the child protection space and the sports space. I want to speak very quickly about the system strengthening, which is one of the areas of work that we do. And I want to talk about system strengthening in the sense that it's one child. And so when we break down the systems and say this is what sports can do, this is what education can do, this is what social protection can do. So we have little splinters, and the end result is little splinters of bits of action. But if we can bring this, if you think of it as moving molecules, and you bring them together around a nucleus, and the child is the nucleus, then you're able to form something that is solid and substantive. And so system strengthening is really taking all the little pieces, bringing them together, and continuing to build up upon that. And so I would urge, even as Sports for Development picks up the momentum on keeping children safe, let's not establish a new system. It exists. Let's strengthen it, let's beef it up, and let's make sure that everything coalesces around the nucleus. And I'm not a chemist, but I can just recall how the nucleus and the electrons all move around, and the child simply has to be the nucleus. And just lastly, but this should have been my first point, is the importance of listening to children and children's participation in their voices. I have a 9-year-old, I have a 20-year-old. All of this, both of them, and I have 2 others in between, but all of my 4 children, each person knows exactly what it is that they want. And so meaningful child participation means that this can be an important entry point that can be used for really making sure that children's evolving capacities are reflected, and we build their agency, because it's the same thing you're talking about. How does sports, how does education, how does the health system really enable children to speak up for themselves and to say either yes or to say no? And it really comes from then a place where you find children themselves become, using a rights-based approach, full agents. And I don't want to, yes, autonomous beings. They are autonomous beings, full autonomous beings, full agents who can actually be able to claim and speak up for what it is that they want and what it is that works for them. And I see sports and child protection really interfacing there at the point of system strengthening and really amplifying the voices for children. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I keep thinking about what you said, borrowed and adapted, and I love that, because I think so many times we try to reinvent the wheel. And maybe coming back to you, Erin, when you think about everything you've learned, all of the changes you've gone from this big document with 18 different points, what can we all learn? Maybe what are some key points that you want to share with our audience in making them more efficient, more effective, and obviously able to drive that change that we're all looking for?
Well, we're so well aligned, actually. We met like the first people at the reception, so this is clearly serendipity that we're sitting here on the panel, because I am going to say almost exactly what you said and just reinforce it. I agree completely. Don't reinvent the wheel. When Spotlight Initiative was born, we exactly did what you just suggested. We scanned from the existing best practice, the existing evidence, and we drew that together. And really, I think of it as kind of a beautiful quilt to piece together the evidence of what works. And of course, and it's so important to contextualize, and His Royal Highness said this as well, so that you know that what's working well in Malawi will look different in Argentina, will look different in Afghanistan. So what we tried to do was to create this patchwork of evidence and a frame. And again, this frame was really considering what we know works from a perspective of this everything, everywhere, all at once. And yes, I know it's a movie title, but I'm still going to use it. Of really this comprehensive approach. And so build this evidence base, but then ensure it has flexibility and adaptability. And in our first phase, we really intentionally invested in a range of contexts and tested the model. So we did. We invested in contexts like Argentina and in Afghanistan. And we stayed in Afghanistan. And we pivoted the model. And we tested it in context where governments change. And we really looked at how we could evolve with the evolving context and stay and deliver in service to women and girls. Based on that, we were able to really deliver proof of concept for this model. By the end of this year, we will have saved the lives of 21 million women and girls through this model. That is true impact. The second lesson is meaningful collaboration. And I've mentioned civil society and government, and that's, I think, those are the most important stakeholders. They really bookend the initiative. But also private sector, academia, so really kind of cast a wide net for collaboration. In many countries, it was the faith leaders who drove this initiative, who helped define and who really were the ones who made the biggest impact in helping to advance some of the most progressive elements of Spotlight Initiative in Niger, for example. So really keep an open mind on who your allies might be in being the greatest champions for this initiative. And also consider that from a sustainability lens and build that in from the very beginning. National ownership is critical, and we're really looking at that now as we document the knock-on impact of our initial investments. And then finally, be really flexible. Make sure that your program isn't so rigid that you can't quickly pivot to changing contexts, like I mentioned Afghanistan, but we also, we invest in many contexts where there are cyclical disasters in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, many parts of Southeastern Africa. And so we had to be ready to pivot to ensure that our funding could go where the needs were. As a Sustainable Development Goal initiative, one of the core principles of that is leave no one behind. Well, those left furthest behind are often those most impacted by political and sudden onset disaster, and so we needed to be able to ensure our funding could go and respond to that. In doing all three of these things, what we've been able to show is a real solid value for money. And I hate putting a price tag on this, honestly, putting a price tag on the lives of children, on the lives of women. It's not kind of an easy thing, but in this funding scarce environment, it often is the thing that we need to do. And we've been able to empirically document the immense value for money that initiatives like Spotlight Initiative can have to really drive meaningful change with very little, actually, investment.
Thank you very much. No, I think, and we've seen it yesterday in the poll, we've seen how, money does play a big role, and I imagine that the two of you were connected because you cannot really separate women and children from children and girls, and it all is interconnected. So maybe coming back to you, Dr. Joanne, when you think about the role of sport, what are maybe some of the key entry points that it can play in places like Africa?
I think for me as a Kenyan in sports and the track, though I never was an athlete, we have Paul Tergat here. I think the role of sports, and I want to speak about this, yes, from a Kenyan perspective, as a Kenyan, but also from the African Partnership perspective. And the African Partnership to End Violence Against Children has over 150 members now spread across, I think, 26 countries and 5 of Africa's regional economic communities. Africa has the African Union, which brings all 55 countries together, but we also have sub-regions. The Southern Africa has its own sub-regional community, East Africa, West Africa, and there's another COMESA that brings together, I think, 22 countries across the Central, East, and Southern Africa. So when we look at all these diverse memberships, one of the things that sports can do is really find multiple points of entry to really, I don't want to say to influence, but to bring change. And so I see, for instance, the Olympic movement, and I have a confession to make, and yesterday another person made a confession. This is the first time in 18 years of working on women's rights, girls' rights, and children's rights that have interacted with the sports movement, with the Olympic movement. And so I see, why have I not, and of course I'm not a prototype, but why hasn't there been closer connection between the mainstream human rights space, child protection, women's rights, and the sports sector? So that interfacing, the joint approach where we can actually be able to have joint efforts and have the multiplier effect that we're talking about is one of the points of entry. How do we plug into the different institutions across Africa through different points of entry, some of which will be in what I alluded to earlier, whether it's health, education, trade even, because there has to be the economic growth in order to have the sports infrastructure developed. So that's one. The second one I want to speak about is, unfortunately in Africa, right now we have 22 active conflicts. And by active conflicts, we mean where people are displaced, where there's unrest, where there's insecurity to the extent that when you hear of countries like Burkina Faso or Niger, Sudan, South Sudan, DRC, the Congo, it's where there's places which can no longer be inhabited. So how do we reach children in those most difficult to reach places? I think there's certain things which are very core and inherent in humans. It's playing, it's sports. Even in those displaced people's camps, in the, under the sun, under the trees, on the dirt tracks, how do we build in sports into humanitarian responses? Because I think sports can be used, I think, not just for peace building, but even for healing, for therapy. So let's not think of, it's difficult to bring in sports into the most fragile, volatile situations, which almost a third of African countries are. I think even in those, we must be able to find a way and to enter through the humanitarian response structures and systems. And in those, of course, it has to be then sensitive to gender, sensitive to children of all diversities, abilities, etc. The third thing I want to speak about is really how do we go beyond the child protection system itself and go into what is bigger, because children are simply one piece, if I can call them that, of an entire national system. And how do we link the child protection system to other national systems where sports can also come in? And so that means we're talking about having a systems approach, but multi-systems approach. And in that multi-systems approach, then we want to have multiple actors, multiple sectors, and at multiple levels. We want it at the community level, and we want it at national level. And then, of course, linking to the African Union level and all the other governance bodies. I'll stop there in the interest of time.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for speaking to us today. I love this idea, linking things up. So let's continue to link things up through official partnerships, through having you here on stage and meeting your first Olympian yesterday, if I'm not mistaken. Congratulations to both of you, and thank you for being with us.